Actually, we have a couple of minutes. I'm going to take the prerogative of moderator to pose a couple of questions to them that I'd like to hear them talk about and talk among themselves for a few minutes before we open it up. And I think what I'm going to do is get both of my questions on the table so they can mull them both and then and decide how they want to respond. The first question came out really from some explicit content, really from the beginning. From Vanessa's paper, it was picked up quite explicitly, and Gina's less so in the later papers. But I think it would be really interesting to speak to, initially from a philosophical perspective and a political perspective, what's the problem with difference? And are you, in fact, talking about methodological interventions that are somehow required to minimize difference in order to be all right? I'm posing this provocatively because I engage with you guys and I know very well, Gina and I have actually written somewhat on this topic, but I think it's important to address it really explicitly about, is there some inherent value to finding similarity as opposed to finding difference in the brain? And what happens, why do we want to think about how methods may be aiming more towards one or the other? And is there some fundamental position you would want to take about that and reflect on it? The second, I'm going to pick up from, I'm hoping I'm getting her name right because the work came to mind. I had a brief exchange with Jonathan, and I think it's the philosopher Letitia Meynell. Is that her name? Is that correct? Okay. She has written on some of the philosophical and epistemological problems with the reading of fMRI in particular. And probably, Annalise, you can help me and know which piece this is. I think it might come from the collection that Schmitz and Hopner edited, or else it comes from Robin Blum's collection, also a neurofeminism collection. In that collection, Professor Meynell describes two fundamental properties of images that make fMRIs particularly difficult for lay people to read, and in fact even make experts in fMRI have a hard time because we use other images in such a different way from what fMRI is. And those two properties are representativeness and transparency. And the idea that certain images are meant to represent something, to somehow present the experience of viewing a thing in the world, even if that thing in the world doesn't exist. So representativeness even applies to paintings of Zeus. It doesn't matter that Zeus doesn't exist. The representativeness of the painting means that it is supposed to evoke the experience of what a viewer looking at Zeus would get. And second, transparency applies in particular to machine-made images. It's a notion that comes from especially photography and film, the idea that you know how an image is made, that we have general knowledge of how a photographic negative and print is made. We know that it has to do with pointing the apparatus at an object and the way that light is captured, et cetera, et cetera. Both of those properties are violated with fMRI, and I think it would be interesting if you, from your different perspectives, could talk just a little bit about one or the other or both, and how that matters for sex. What is it about representativeness and transparency, maybe? Anyway, that's a lot to ask you, but let's maybe start with the question about difference and similarity. Is there some reason to prefer one or the other, and what do our habits of scientific analysis do right now?
Sure. Given the historical story, especially that Gina was telling, the history of looking at sex-gender differences has been in the vein that women are somehow inferior. So difference has always been couched for this question in terms of an inferiority. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, because given that our brains are plastic, there may be many ways to solve the problem and not just one most efficient way, and there might actually be benefits from having multiple ways of solving the problem. So there's been some recent research in the past, I think 2 years, on diversity and problem solving. So if you have a diverse group as opposed to a more homogeneous group, you get better problem solving. So a group of individuals that have different ways of approaching the problem actually solve the problems better than a group that is coming from the same perspective. So the important thing is, if we want to keep investigating difference, we did not stop valuing one over the other, and just recognize that difference is actually a good thing, and it can improve our problem solving and improve the way we look at and address the world.
Okay. Could I go next? Yeah. I mean, I think, Vanessa, and implicit in your question is the difference being a problem, in that in this particular area of research, difference tended to mean one superior, one inferior. So there was a focus on the interpretation of those differences to maintain a status quo, describe what was felt to be an appropriate social hierarchy or whatever. But I think it's important. I'm aware that we seem to be dissing our discipline, and there are some fantastic things that can be done with brain imaging, and it's really important to understand what they're telling us. But the focus on difference is so embedded in the idea that there's some kind of hierarchy you're trying to explain. I think the problem lies there. As Beck will know, people like herself and me get called sex difference deniers or anti-sex difference researchers, in the same kind of tone as climate change deniers, presumably with the same consequence for the future of civilization as we know it. But I think the issue is the term difference and how it's become loaded, and I think that's what we need to look at.
You two want to add anything?
Well, sex sells, I guess. So, if when you organize science by sort of simplified, common sense, sexual ideas of sexual difference, the interpretive community is already well formed, so that people are willing to read the results in a way that makes sense at a common sense level. I think the questions being raised by this panel and by your research that I know a little bit are really complexifying those ideas, and so sort of thinking about the historical basis for the sexing of subjectivities and bodies, right? So what you're looking at when you look at a scan, even if you're looking at many mediations, you're also looking at a historical result, not an ontological reality. But those are really difficult things to talk about, because they bring in sort of socio-historical concerns into the space of scientific discourse, which sometimes it's more convenient to ignore that.
I just would add that for me, the problem with differences that they are based on categories, and these categories are historically exactly, and they are also what is represented. So the difference is what is also. So it's also representative for what this kind of category is and what it has to be. So I think it's the narration and also the narrowness of categories, and then why should they be different? I mean, so.
That's helpful. I'm gonna make one tiny plug and addition to that, which is modes of representing difference, is something that lots of feminist scientists have talked about, and not only feminist scientists, many scientists involved in a lot of different fields over the last few decades have talked about the importance of not having, for example, just single point estimate differences for groups, but looking at overlapping distributions, looking at confidence intervals, looking at things like that, not just focusing on saying these two are different, but talking about effect sizes, how different, how much does it matter in the world. And so that would be one thing I would throw. Another thing that I would want to just throw out is that at this moment, structurally, we know that there, for example, the recent calls from the Institute of Medicine and so on have very specifically called for people to investigate not sex, not the mechanisms and effects of sex, but to investigate sex difference. So there's been a strong priority on documenting and expanding this giant catalog of differences. And I would say that one of the things that happens from that is you lose focus on useful information about mechanisms very often. That when you think of difference and that's where your focus is, it becomes static and it becomes actually often a less creative and productive place for knowledge production. And I wonder if my other question was too convoluted, if you guys would like to just talk to each other for a minute, that's fine. We're going to we have lots of time still for audience questions, so I'd still like to take another 5 minutes for the panel to talk to each other. Why don't I sort of slide my thing off the table, that representation and transparency. You can deal with it if you want, but I'd rather hear you guys talk to each other. Okay? Uh-oh, pressure's on.
Okay, I'll say just one thing about transparency, because actually I was addressing that in my Nell piece in my own remarks, because it operates with an idea that photographs actually are transparent. And what Flusser suggests, and I agree with much of what he says, is that these are not windows. These are actually encodings of surfaces in using the history of abstraction and mediation in order to create a meaningful image. If you think you're actually looking at a window, then you can't possibly interpret the image because you're not. And this sort of idea or ideology of what an image is replicated in sort of the echo sonic imaging of a fetus, for example, where the woman's body is erased, right, and the fetus addresses you as if you were a subject-to-subject relationship. And that creates a whole sort of idea that there's intersubjectivity here, the woman's body is peripheral, all that stuff, precisely because it adopts the conventions of photographic imaging in the first place. So those images unconsciously affect the way one conceives of the relationship between an unborn human being and the knower, right? And there's a whole politics to that, right? I mean, if one thinks about the unit of the body and the fetus, or one thinks of a larger unit where you have community and it's community's knowing, then you might ask a whole different set of questions about what's going on.
Okay. I've got a question for Hannah. I was interested that you chose the kind of Muybridge type demonstration of how an image becomes a moving image, etc. And I wonder why you chose that particular focus for image making, given, is it because you think there's a disconnect between those kind of images and what it looks like we're getting from brain imaging?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I used it because Farocki is talking about this rematerialization in the interview, and he also points to the beginnings of imaging of Muybridge, because the measurement and the vision and the imaging was together. Because so you had the movement, and through the movement you measured an image and you made the images, and that is what I would also say that in imaging nowadays in fMRI, like a lot of the tradition of measuring human beings is implicated in the technique already through algorithms and stuff like that. So I was trying to point out that there's a history of this coming together from measurement and imaging, and that we have this with these new technologies, we have this again. So that was my intention.
I'm going to just quickly say, Hannah, can you say just a couple of words about the question you've been posing about the translation, like getting from an object to numbers back to images, because I think that might be an interesting, just a little bit of good elaboration.
This is, I think, a little bit what's the video also about, to bring back the contexts of the bodies who are measured, and through these measurements they get down to numbers in a way, and then the imaging processes are re-visualizing it. So, but there's like a very reductionist steps to numbers, and then it gets back to pictures who are like a lot of like it got census through the people who are looking at them, the scientists, but also like the lay persons. Yeah, I think, and this is a process that is very that is very, so the algorithms have a huge impact on this way of reducing and coming back to a picture. Sorry.
Can I just comment? I think that's really an important political strategy to sort of restructure the space of interpretation of a particular image. I mean, Catherine Hale's stuff, How We Became Posthuman, the first chapter I think is called How Information Lost Its Body, right? And it's all about how information lost its body. So it's all about the process of abstraction, the separate. So you can download your consciousness into Google, right? Kurzweil works for Google now, and he's the author of the stuff about the singularity, where you can basically separate, consciousness supposedly from bodies. Of course, it's like white men who do that, and everybody else is still stuck in their bodies. But this sort of disembodied idea is a way of it's an imaginary about information and what to do with information and how to treat it. So putting the MRI back into a photographic context, actually, to me anyway, is a way of recontextualizing it and opening it to other kinds of interpretation and sort of really expanding the field of not only analysis but social negotiation, which is very specialized and siloed at this point. And when a few specialists have sort of like control over those images, even though they affect everyone, then you have a problem.
I think we could open it up to the audience now. Are there? Good, we've already got one question or comment here.
Thank you very much for extremely interesting conversation. But I personally, as a woman, hope that at last we find some differences in female brain, because male-dominated civilizations come to this crisis, and maybe we have to fix it somehow. If we absolutely similar, absolutely like identical, how we can then take advantage of being females. And but my question is about instruments that we use for imaging. I was very glad that you mentioned that Salmon, because I know about this experiment by Dr. Bennett, I think, for some time. But magnetic resonance imaging, it's produced extremely strong field that actually affects the state of the subject, the state of the objects. It's, for example, anywhere near MRI you cannot have any metal. And so it definitely affects the state in the moment of the imaging. And for example, there was several already articles and papers about how ultrasound affects mice. It appears that prenatal ultrasound, the mice that have prenatal ultrasound less social and has differences in the brain that compared to autistic children.
I'm going to
yes.
ask if you have a question. That's a good comment, but maybe they can expand
my
on. But
question
is there a
about
question?
imaging.
Okay.
So these instruments, they affect the state of the subject. So how we separate this? Okay.
I'm just at a technical level. fMRI, I don't think, is a good instrument for asking these sort of questions. It's too slow for the processes we're looking at. I use MEG, which is looking at the magnetic fields associated with brain activity. It's not noisy, it's not invasive. We can use it with children, adults, etc. And I think you do get a much better picture of the processes you're looking at. I do agree that MRI is a problem. I guess in terms of, if you're interested in blood flow changes, it can be give you very detailed images of what structures there are in the brain and some of the functions associated with them. But you assume that the process, and this may be a wrong assumption, is similar for whatever you're getting the participant to do. So even if it does change the state in a particular way, you're assuming that it changes the state in the same way, whether they're looking at a picture of a happy face or a house or whatever. But I do think MRI is a problem, and because all of the images that we tend to look at now are from MRI, it's something we should be aware of. I agree.
Yes.
This question is directed to Professor Bentley, but is obviously open for comment. You mentioned that one of your ultimate goals is to break the gender dichotomy. And I was sort of wondering how this work that you're looking at between sex can sort of translate into an improved understanding of trans identity, in the sense that viewing brains that are male or female, how can we understand those fluid identities rather than a fixed difference? And if you could speak to sort of what that looks like, switching from binary to fluid in the field of neuroscience.
Sure, that's fantastic. And as far as I know, we are still stuck in the mode. So neuroscientists seem to be stuck in the mode of focusing on sex and don't even recognize that there's gender for the most part. That might be changing. So I think that there are baby steps to get us to closer to that point, and that is to get those people that are doing this type of research to learn a little bit more about what sex and gender is. And then we can start thinking about, like, especially as I said, focusing on sex gender differences, we take the perspective of the women because those are the ones who have been traditionally been oppressed. One could argue that those that are trans are even in further systems of oppression, more so than women. So to investigate the question of what's going on for those that are trans or have queer identities and things like that, we certainly need to start from that perspective, involve them in the research, find out how they're describing their experiences, what types of questions they're interested in, and they may help us direct the research to a way that will help the research come out to illuminate their experiences without being oppressive to them. So we might be some, especially those that are in the neurogenderings group, might be closer to being able to do the trans research, but across the community, now would be a good time for us to start thinking about it and can start conceptualizing to begin to understand those types of issues.
Yeah, Gina.
I'd like to speak to that as well, if that's okay, and it touches a bit on a comment the previous questioner raised, and that's the whole concept of female brain, male brain, that there's categories. Again, it's a language issue. The assumption is that a person who is biologically a woman has a female brain. If you challenge researchers who talk about brain sex, or there are websites where you can measure whether you're male or female brain, and somebody will say, oh, you don't have to be a man to have a male brain. And you say, so why do you call it a male brain? And I think that's a really important question. But it's certainly the case that the whole concept of, if I'd had another 10, 15 minutes, the whole concept of a dichotomy between male and female is really up for grabs, right at even the fundamental level of our own cells, but certainly in imaging. And that then means that when you start to talk about trans people, then you should say, actually, maybe the problem, they describe themselves as being in the wrong boxes. Maybe the problem is the boxes. There shouldn't be boxes, in which case that changes how you ask the question. But I think it's really important in this area.
I wonder, without too much putting her on the spot, we have in the audience somebody who, Dr. Anneliese Kaiser, has been doing phenomenal research on this related questions. Anneliese was one of the founders is one of the founders of the Neurogenderings Network and does super exciting research precisely trying to get away from starting with these categories. Is it too much to ask you to say a very short thing about this question?
About the question of transgender?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I can only say how I am approaching it. Since I don't believe in, and I don't think there's a female and male brain, first of all, I tried to get as many people into my study as possible in terms of gender diversity. So I asked people of all genders to have them into my group, into my population. And also people with gender identities that are not male in a way, not female, distinct male and female identities. And the other way I wanted to approach this question of transgender whatsoever is that I let them fill out a questionnaire, a kind of a long questionnaire about this gender question. What about your sex and gender socialization? What about your sex and gender behavior? What about your sex and gender traits? And so I was collecting a lot of information about gender behavior, traits, identity, and this at the end I'm going to put into a relation to the brain. And let's see what the results will show. I'm pretty sure I will be able to project or to show a little bit of more transparency on what concerns different types of gender identity, gender feeling of sex and gender, and stuff like that. So yeah, that was my personal approach to this transgender. Or it's actually not only trans, it's transgender. It's the whole gender spectrum, right?
So gender as more of a disaggregated set of characteristics that, if I may, that gender becomes disaggregated, it becomes domain specific, it becomes, you break away from dichotomies and you break away the automatic attachment to bodies. And so that it's not gender as a whole identity position of a human, but it's a much more functional approach, and then see what we can see. We've got time for more questions. Yes.
I apologize in advance for the ignorance that may be belied by my question. But I wonder if you might be able to explain a bit about the effect of hormones on the kind of brain activity that is measured by the kind of imaging that you described. And part of what inspires my question is that you'll have to forgive me that I don't remember who is responsible for this experiment, but recently I learned of an experiment that studies mice, and it exposes mice to testosterone during the critical period of development. And what it shows is that in, anatomically female mice, I believe that they displayed male mating behavior, and that it was only due to the exposure of testosterone during the critical period, that they were not exposed to hormones subsequently. And I wonder if that is not, that does not have something to do with the organization of the brain, or and might not be evidence on a grander scale, given that, there are certain, it's not cut and dry. Not every woman and every man has exactly the same kind of hormonal processes, but there are undeniable differences between men and women in the hormone processes. And I wonder, if that might be a more sort of concrete explanation for differences that exist in the way that we think. And I wonder, just in terms of the kind of imaging that you're describing, if the activity is inspired by those hormones, or if that's sort of a missing piece that would not show up in.
Thanks.
It has to be you, though.
This is pretty much my.
She's written the book.
Yeah. So there are so many places to come into that question, but the first place that I think it's useful to start is to say that implicit in the question is to say, is that, wait, maybe hormones are the best way to explain these differences, right? So first we have to back up and say which differences, and say that one of the important points of data is that the vast majority of the human differences that are found over and over are so far not replicated, first of all. They're under these very precise conditions. So you have to, first, don't get too attached to the idea that there are firm and replicated differences in imaging. And also when Gina talks about that fMRI isn't even the right tool. So you would need to be really cautious about looking at differences that emerge from that tool. Professor Janet Hyde has written a very famous paper called the Gender Similarities Hypothesis, where if you think about why do you want to know about differences in the brain, very often it's because of real or implied relationships, of course, between the brain and behavior, between personality characteristics, things we do. So you also then want to know what's the data about actual behavior, not how do we think women and men are different, but what do we know about how men and women really are in terms of personality and so on. So both from vast meta-analyses of behavior, personality traits, etc., what you see is that there actually are way, way fewer differences, and those differences are much smaller than we think. Now that doesn't mean there are none, and it doesn't mean that differences aren't important, but I think we have to be cautious about understanding, to not just mistake our beliefs about female and male behavior, which tend to really exaggerate and multiply differences. So that's one thing. Another is there are different species. There are really, really different patterns of female and male behavior as well as brain across species. So all of that is quick background. But let's quickly think about the studies that you're talking about. It's a huge, huge network of studies that you could call brain organization studies that are looking at the effects of steroid hormones, especially testosterone, on the developing brain in critical periods. And there are many, many, many important effects of steroid hormone exposures that happen early in the brain. Steroids are very important. However, one of the most interesting and under-noticed facts is that the claim that those changes, the effects of early steroid exposures, the idea that those are permanent and that they then set down templates for behavior that last throughout a lifetime is in general not actually true. That there is much, much more that's known. It's not across the board not true. For example, it can set receptor patterns, it can set a variety of things. But from very early in those organization experiments, we've known that subsequent experiences or subsequent exposures can really change that effect. So let's say you give a genetically female mouse a high level of testosterone in brain development. She mounts other animals much more often than is typical for females. If you then change her cage conditions, change what other littermate, who else is in the cage with her, give her some time with a sexually experienced male, for example. All those effects of the testosterone actually can be completely reversed. So the point here is plasticity, and the point is that a lot of the experiments on sex that are related to sex have been hermetically sealed from what we understand about brain plasticity. And we have isolated experiments about changeability that very often there's been a failure to systematically follow through some of those data. But I would refer you to, as another point, just quickly, and I'll stop and give this back to him. I refer you to some papers by Daphne Joel, who is a neuroscientist at the University of Tel Aviv in Israel. And she has some beautiful new demonstration on brain mosaicism that I think further informs this question. Other questions? Yes?
One statement. I could imagine that some of the researchers who are very uncritical of sex essentialism would be happy to take up the question of trans persons, and they would predictably find that they would change their dichotomy into a trichotomy. And that's very different. The idea that there are, you've all offered critiques of the notion that there are two silos in which all humans fit, and they can be studied within their silos to look for these differences, as opposed to this much sort of looser configuration of associations, which may or may not fall within a silo as it's conventionally understood. I mean, to the extent that these silos are derived from Victorian science, which imagine there were two categories, and the categories were formed by your reproductive organs, and everything else about you flowed and developed from that. I mean, the challenge that caused them to develop the idea of the invert was the fact that people showed up. Some appeared to be gender conforming, to use our lingo, but had an erotic interest in the wrong direction. And yet others showed up who were gender non-conforming, but their erotic interest was in the right direction. So essentially they were confronted with people who did not fit into normative categories, but their solution was to make a third category.
I've used an analogy in another context. There's a particular type of brain injury that affects the frontal lobes, and there's a task called the Wisconsin card sorting task, where you get people to sort cards according to different categories, like all the colour of the cards, etc. And then the experimenter changes the category, and the people have to start sorting the cards in terms of different categories. And people with frontal lobe damage just can't change the category they're using. They perseverate, is what it's called. And I sometimes think that people who are doing research in this area have some form of scientific frontal lobe damage. Those categories have been there forever. So we have to, that must be a man. Yeah, okay, it looks a bit different, but I'm sure if we maybe make the category a bit bigger or just ignore that bit that's different. And I absolutely agree. And I think the work that Daphne Joel is doing that's been mentioned, and as I said, even right down to the cellular level, we're suddenly starting to think that actually we shouldn't be thinking these kind of categories. I mean, it might mean rewriting a lot of science, but hopefully doing science better, but I agree particularly.
And it would allow things like actually, to investigate those really important effects of steroids, for example, and looking at, what difference does it really matter in a mechanistic way, whether there's 2X chromosomes for a particular kind of very precise, process. Perhaps there are times where that certainly matters, but that it's hard for us to stay precise enough when we perseverate. I think that's helpful.
And just to grab one of that just for a second, a little bit of work has been done that I know in the mental rotation on individuals who are going sex reassignment surgeries and have the hormone replacement. And different from what you're saying, they are still trying to categorize them into biologically female or biologically male, or the type of brain that they're trying to be. So it's still just the two brain categories, not a third category like you're suggesting. So just in this one area, it's still just the two categories.
I wonder if you all could speculate on what the effect of the NIH, I don't know what to call it, ruling.
Mandate.
Yes, mandate, to have equal numbers of male and female mice, even down to the cellular level, I guess. Whether that will further reify these differences, or whether it has the potential for actually starting people to think differently about it.
Gina, I think you're a good candidate.
Okay. I think the use of the term differences, I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be an explosion of new findings of sex differences.
That are meaningless,
but particularly as we have this kind of publication bias where you only get something published if you find a difference, and not if you don't. That's a generalization. Come back to that.
Is that true? I mean, is that true that there's today in neuroscience?
I think certainly in cognitive neuroscience, if you, it's what they call the file drawer problem. You do a study trying to find the effect of something on something else, and you don't find it. So either you redo the study, but you don't publish the fact that you didn't find a difference, and that means, the hapless journalists that I've mentioned coming to the literature and see, look at this huge body of literature showing differences, not realising that there's even huger body of differences of literature where there's no differences.
That's another question that I had, is because, we have the public understanding of science, which is very much about difference, obviously. But is that really what's going on in neuroscience? I mean, that publication bias still exists in neuroscience? Or?
It's actually quite difficult to prove, obviously, because you've got to go to people and say, how many experiments haven't you published? I mean, one of the things we've talked about is the idea that, like in clinical trials, that you actually...
Publish everything.
you publish everything, or you establish your protocol in advance and say what you find. But I think to come back to what you said about the NIH, I think there'll be a lot of explosion of we found sex differences, etc. I think which is unfortunate, because what they're trying to do is say, is there a sex effect?
Right.
So does sex moderate responsiveness to drugs in a particular way, which I think is really important to ask. And I think there's that kind of tension which categorizing the whole term difference is a problem. And I think the way in which the statistics are then stacked to find a difference, as opposed to the kind of work that Anneliese has been doing, where you could do what they call multivariate analysis, where you don't have your nice little boxes and compare this one with this one. You just have a look at these continuous variables and how they interact and how one variable might predict another. I think I can see why the NIH are doing it, but even so, the basis. Sorry, I'm taking the mic. I was going to say the basis of that, in particular, really characterises one of the problems. Differences between the sleep drug Zolpidem. It was found that the dosage was much too high, quotes, for women. But if you look at the data, you can see that in fact it was too high for about a third of the men as well. So assuming that if you're a man, then this is your prescription, or if you're a woman, that's your prescription, is what they're after, and actually that in itself is still a problem. So
yeah, and I believe that some quite simple variables explain the difference better. If I'm not mistaken, body size and BMI together, I think it was not just one simply, but it was perhaps weight and BMI explains better than sex. I could don't quote me, but Sarah Richardson did an analysis and found that there were a couple of simple variables that were routinely not reported in this whole using Ambien as this great case.
Can I just offer an outsider's perspective, which is, it seems that no single change is going to fix what is a perennial set of problems. I mean, what I really enjoy about this conversation is that it's raising questions about the social and political role of neuroscience, and therefore also the social and political responsibility of neuroscientists. And if one sort of bases research on categories which are social and historical and founded on violence, I mean, the social difference, I mean, if you think about patriarchy, if you think about the way racism works, these are the creation of subjects through historical forms of violence. If the categories which are founded on violence are incorporated into scientific research, then that science necessarily reproduces that violence and legitimates it. So, I mean, when one thinks about the social and historical role of research, one has to be able to ask a whole sort of complex set of cultural questions. And that's why I don't think one thing is going to fix any of this, but the change in the discourse is what's most important.
And just to comment back about the changes in the 80s when they started, with the FDA required women to be used in early stages of clinical trials, was in part because women were dying in such great numbers to the dosages that had been worked out for men. So that was an important thing to understand, that women weren't metabolizing drugs in the same way. Then if we're pushing back to even in the laboratory studies, we're using animal or even tissue samples, there still is going to remain a gap that has yet to be understood for the physiology of sex differences versus all of these types of especially relevant cognitive and socially relevant categories of sex differences that have yet to be explored. So that is a question that still needs to be investigated if it's going to make any impact using those things in the lab, and if it makes any different for these high-level cognitive important things that we address in our day-to-day lives in navigating the world.
Yeah, actually, I was just wondering I would say that most of the studies in neuroscience are not on gender difference. So I think it would be important to, I don't know, I don't think that there should be a lot of studies on mice, but you can start there to say you need like half and half population. And in the studies where you do try to find sex differences, most of the time you have half and half of the problems are male or female. So, yeah.
What I would draw from that maybe is there are definite interesting possibilities And there are problems with routinely only using male animals, quite obviously. I would like to direct anybody interested in this question. There's a journal, an online journal called Catalyst, that has a fantastic discussion of this new rule. And it's a very informed discussion that is put forward by a bunch of scientists and philosophers and science and technology studies scholars. And I'd say that two very basic points from that are, first, that it's an idea that wasn't put forward with quite enough methodological infrastructure. So, for example, people are not prepared to approach this new mandate with a really sophisticated view of what do you mean by sex? How do we go about measuring it? So that there's a tendency, for example, to not be specific about that. For example, if you're going to mandate sex, are you mandating that people do analyses by the chromosome of the animals, by the hormone status? I mean, Arnold and others have done this 4-core model of sex. That's progress. That's a start. But bringing together the kinds of more specific approaches to sex with this mandate is one really huge missing link in the mandate. Another piece is that, again, it's been put forward in the context of prioritizing the documentation of difference instead of prioritizing what probably is the underlying driving interest, which is what's the effect, but framing it really matters. Are there more? Yeah, one more question, but I think we might have talk fatigue.
Hi, so I'm curious as to what you guys think of, there was a new drug, I think 9 months ago, that came out on the market, the first drug for female sexual dysfunction. I think it's called Addy. And so it's the first, there was no other prior pharmacological treatment for female sexual dysfunction, even though we all know there are a multitude for men. And this drug acts on the brain, acts on certain neurotransmitters, I think norepinephrine and serotonin, whereas male sexual dysfunction treatments are more on blood flow, things like that. So you guys are talking about progress and how it's true that we're able to change the narrative, but there seems to be this idea that the brain serves different functions for the different genders, and even the genitalia may serve different functions for different genders. So what do you think of that treatment, if you've ever heard of it?
Flibanserin is the generic name of the drug, you guys?
It has really, really poor rates of effectiveness.
There needs to be a bigger conversation about sexual pleasure and the focus on heterosexual pleasure and a narrative that sexual pleasure for women has to be an orgasm. So there's a book, The Evolution of the Female Orgasm, Bias in the Science and Evolutionary Biology by philosopher Elizabeth Lloyd. So she looked at the different explanations for female orgasm and found that pretty much all of them based in evolutionary biology fail on its own empirical basis. It fails to meet the standards of science within its own field. Which, and again, this is the assumption of sexism and androcentrism in the science that continues to promote research within this field, that they're blind to their own sexism and their own perspective that they're bringing into it. I'll leave it there with where she ends up with what she thinks is the best explanation, which is the really awesome side effect explanation of why there are women orgasms. But the truth is, women just don't orgasm at the rate of men. And if we continue to count that as the measure of sexual satisfaction, we're just missing the thing. So we need to involve women in the research and find out what makes them most satisfied out of their relationships, and try to cultivate better conversations with their partners and about the whole culture of sex to better meet those needs.
Honey, you just spent days with Leonore Tiefer. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the long tradition of medicamentization of women's bodies and on women's sexuality. And I mean, there have been so many studies in feminist science for that sexuality is not something that takes place in the brain, but at the same time it is. So it has to do with pleasure and everything, and how you feel, like self-confidence and stuff like that. And I think it's like this tradition that makes like male always think of sex, and they just have to bring the blood pressure in the right way, and then everything is fine. And and the female body has to be prepared for wanting sex like this. I think I don't know. I think it sucks. Sorry for that.
I think to bring Daphne's paper into it yet again, it's called Sex Beyond the Genitalia, and I think that's quite a good title because it's not just about the genitalia. But I also think with those particular studies, again, if you look at the overlap of the data and the characteristics of the individuals who have requested them or who need them, then I suspect it wouldn't, you would have a huge overlap of data. I think trying to put it into two boxes again is the problem.
Yeah, and in this particular case, this theory of, the hydraulic view of men, just needing enough blood flow to carry through their will, and women needing to be primed to want, what's fascinating is, really, they were casting around for any old drug where they could find some kind of statistically significant effect with the female sample, and it took an awful lot of manipulation to get a fairly marginal effect, but finally get it going. So it's a good question and a lot of good responses for that. I think. Oh, one more. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important for people just to know the backdrop to the FDA approval,
right?
Because the drug was rejected by an FDA panel
twice.
And a drug company snapped it up as sort of an innovative profit maker if they could only get it approved. And it almost never happens that a drug is brought back for a third go-round. But they orchestrated what appeared to be, though it was seen through pretty quickly, a feminist agitation with cries that men have 30 kinds of,
pills.
Erectile dysfunction.
Right. Formulations of the same drug. And we women have nothing. And that's sexism. And, so in thinking about advocacy and feminist advocacy, and this was kind of like astroturfing, a feminist cry, and many other people were just horrified by this. So it's been approved, it's selling very badly. You have to take this pill every day. A meta-analysis just came in from Europe showing that the effect of it, as you said, is like minuscule. And when you take the pill every day, you cannot drink.
Wow.
On that note.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Well, that's on that note. Maybe we should all grab a drink. Thank you.